The questions that was asked was, what do you think happens to European cities? I've not done original research here, but what I'm going to do today is share with you a number of thoughts about this model of European cities as we put it forward and some of the transformation going on. I emphasize, it's okay the sound? I emphasize the fact that these are more few thoughts and thinking about the subject rather than the result of a proper research. Some of you will know I'm not a planner, I am not a geographer, I am not an architect, so my understanding of cities is more related to social science and comparative political economy. I will do three things. Number one, I will review very briefly some of the classic arguments in the model we elaborated, in particular with Arnaldo Bagnasco. Second, I will discuss some of the criticism about this European city category and the debate we had. And thirdly, and most importantly, I will try to give some ideas about some of the transformation going on at the moment because of the crisis. And I will try to make an argument about, what is going on, trying to deal with too many things in a superficial way, and you will not blame me too much for that. But basically my argument is that from the 1980s to the years 2000, the transformation of European cities was firstly explained by their own collective strategy and the mobilization within a favorable environment. My argument is that today we still have this continuation of some of the characteristics of European cities, but the environment has changed. And both the economic crisis and, most importantly, the changing form of the state are probably starting to erode some of the characteristics of the European city model. So the point is, they have less room of maneuver and they are very much more under constraint. So that will be the theme that I will develop today. Basically, and that's my introduction, at the end of this book on European cities, I finish by saying, basically we have a question. Do we see these European cities and their mode of governance growing, developing new innovations in public policy, being quite prosperous in economic development? And remember, I talk about regional capitals and cities from 200,000 to 3 million inhabitants. Or will they become obsolete over time? Do we see the making of a European urban way? That was our strong argument at the time against the American literature. Or will, eventually, US cities be the model for the organization of European cities? I like to play a game with this idea because I think this tension still is central for what is going on in many cities. So I can remind you of a quote from a guy called Ronald Rogoski. He's a political economist from UCLA, and he did some research on the effect of trade and economic development within a unified single market. So his model was saying, if Europe is serious about a single market, because trade is the central determinant of the organization of cities, over 50 years, Europe will be like the US. We will see the specialization with two very big cities, and then the model of middle-sized European cities will disappear. And yet this very nice quote saying that because of a single market, over 50 years, there will be a carnage among medium-sized European cities. Okay, so that's still the question, and still today, we are not entirely sure about what will go. What was interesting in this analysis was that it was giving two mechanisms to explain this transformation towards a US model. The first one, I just mentioned it, is trade. And the idea that trade was reorganizing the location of cities. His second argument was political. He was saying, because Europe will be more organized by trade and by markets, there will be less public policy, less middle class for the public sector, there will be less investment in the city center, the characteristics of European cities, less welfare states, and middle class will leave the city and will go in suburbs, as they say in English, meaning the city center will become impoverished and we will see the urban crisis like in the US. So his idea was, with less public investment, there will be a decline because of a lack of political support for the development of European cities. So one economic mechanism, one political mechanism. And that's what we disputed and what we showed that it was not going on. So I will play with those two scenarios, whether we will see a sort of rise of megacities and carnage of medium-sized cities in Europe, or do we see the continuous development of globalizing medium-sized European cities? Very, very briefly, I don't want to come back to that, but the idea was that those European cities were a particular model of city inspired by Max Weber and based upon European comparative social sciences and history. And we emphasize, you're very familiar with the long-term meta-stability of the urban map, the original structure of this medium-sized city being the bulk of the European urban map, the importance historically in the territorialization of European societies. You all know that Europeans are less mobile than other parts of the world, the importance of municipalities and political leadership to organize a collective strategy. And I emphasized at that time the idea that those cities were also part of national state, and you know that Europe is the land of public policy. We spend far, far more money on public policy than anybody else in the world. We have a very strong emphasis on the welfare state, and all those elements create social groups, in particular lower middle class and public sector, that are a pillar of left-wing party, green parties, and providing alternative to the more market model that you find in European cities. And what we saw empirically in the 80s, 90s, a little bit less in Italy, but in most European countries, was remarkable dynamism of European cities and metropolis. And we were able to map out huge project investment, demographic and economic growth, decentralization reforms, more elected mayors. There were a number of indicators that were saying exactly the opposite from what the UK people were saying, but in the UK they don't understand European cities anyway, and seen from the US where the literature was saying global city or die. So it was a very strong element. The last thing I emphasized in this model was those European cities developed mode of governance and collective strategies, more or less, but they were in a very favorable environment, including the rise of the EU. And remember, in the 1990s, a long, long time ago, the EU wanted to do a single market, a welfare European state, and a territorial strategy. Jacques Delors had the three ideas. Of course, he failed miserably on the welfare state, not completely, but largely. But at that time, there was also the development of an EU urban strategy, the Urban Initiative, and there were lots of activities around the EU legitimizing and giving some support for various initiatives within cities all over Europe. So it was a very favorable context at that time for European cities. In other words, my analysis was that the European cities were a rather robust model based on public services, private and public firms, and of a very strong pillar of social structure. And because of the decentralization trends that we'd seen in most European city countries, except the UK, as usual, about 60% of public investment was done by local or urban government in the EU. Just to give you a figure, in France, the rate of public investment is a good indicator that's the new investment for the future. In France, in the 60s, the state was doing 85% of public investment. Nowadays, 75% of public investment is done by local authorities, mostly cities. So end of French centralization. And we saw similar trend in a number of countries. So despite all sorts of problems that we still find in European cities, I identify them as a strong urban model, very different from, of course they're not all the same, there are exceptions, but the trends and those characteristics were very strong, including this representation of the city as a whole, this willingness very often to try to develop collective strategies, to reinvent and to develop some strategic projects. And in terms of governance, we were able to show a very strong mobilization of political leaders, the development of public policies, a more strategic approach to governance in a large number of European cities. In my view, it was not an apology of this model. Lots of things didn't work so well in all those cities. And we had riots from time to time. There was still a lot of inequalities, ethnic and religious discriminations, a lot of pressure on social housing. peri-urbanisation sprawl, embourgeoisement. So it was not perfect. It was just one model with some very strong European characteristics, strong welfare state and strong public policy and public investment, strong territorialization with long-term strategy of various groups, and the capacity to develop modes of governance, the inheritance from the municipal model. That was the model. Second point, did it make sense? And what were the criticisms put to this model, and what we can do with that? And my discussion will be divided into two, before the crisis and after the crisis. Okay? So before the crisis, we had lots of debates with various colleagues on European cities. We don't like categories. In social science, we have some people that don't like categories. They always say, you reify category, life is more different, and every city is different. We know that in urban studies, lots of our colleagues, they like to study one city and to show it's different. You know, there are 900 books about Chicago. It's called Chicagology. It's a subfield of urban studies. So the point about doing category is you have various criteria and theoretical ideas in order to compare, then to look at the difference with your model. So there are a number of articles about the post-European city, the neo-European city, the post-neoliberal hybrid. More or less, when people are lost, they invent a neologism and they put neo-hybrid post, which means they're lost. So what I'm going to do is to review briefly a few comments and criticism to nuance some of the thesis that I have put forward. The first point was to really discuss and dispute the importance of strategic collective actors and what has happened since 2002. On that indicator, what was striking was, number one, the development of this model for Eastern Europe. And in Oriental Europe, a lot of cities, as you know, were obliged to import some of the institutions from Western Europe. And in many cases, there was some attempt to try to create forms of collective action looking very much like the European city model. It didn't work all the time, lots of failures, but this model became the reference for a number of local government and urban authorities in Eastern Europe. Most importantly, that was my little triumph, in England, even in England, those ideas became quite strong, and there was a creation of a core cities group, and a number of British, Scottish and English cities, plus Cardiff in Wales, tried to really follow that type of model. Becoming a European city became a priority for a number of either mayors or leaders of council in a number of British cities. And ever since, they have been comparing themselves to the rest of Europe, advocating, trying to get more resources, more investment, and trying to develop collective strategies to become more like European cities, and elected mayors was one part of that. So this model has rather expanded in different parts of Europe. Second, this European city dynamics kept going in a number of many cities. You could see still a lot of new projects, a lot of investment in public transport, in public utilities, development of local welfare, technology clusters. So this idea of trying to, with lots of difficulties, create some forms of collective action and invest on long-term strategy with various types of actors, with all the difficulties, all the flaws and all the failure, remain on average, a very strong priority in a very large number of European cities. So in many ways, this model of European cities and its dynamics, I would argue, remain quite central in a large body of European cities. One of the criticisms that was addressed to the model was to say, this guy is a complete naive, stupid French. He does not understand that cities always go wrong some days, and the future of Europe are shrinking cities. And there's a strong literature, mostly in Germany, a little bit in France and UK, about the future of cities is shrinking cities. You know, when you look at cities, you have people saying it's always wonderful places of innovation, and you have the dark side of a city and things should go wrong and will be worse tomorrow. So there was a very strong literature trying to argue that basically European cities were going to decline, and shrinking cities like we saw in the US, Detroit was supposed to be the model for European cities. And that was not completely wrong, because there were examples of that very strongly in East Germany in particular, Leipzig being the most famous examples. But there is a big research project trying to develop this idea, and except in Italy, where there are clearly some cases, most of the cases that were identified in shrinking cities in Europe were not shrinking. Saint-Étienne has been a very well-known case in France. It's not shrinking. So the shrinking city remained a marginal element in European cities until the crisis. And we saw in the majority of European cities continuous growth, and that was not what was expected. The second criticism that was very strong and very well taken is the idea that beyond the city and the urban region, we saw the rise of these networked urban regions that were mentioned this morning by Marco, and we have seen indeed that in some urban regions in Europe, you have a combination between the city, the metropolis, the urban regions, the rise of some network organization, clearly around Milan, and it's a good case, in the Netherlands, in the Ruhr, in the Lyon regions, there are some cases, and focusing on the dimension of cities and metropolis is clearly not sufficient. I would, however, argue that even in those cases, the city in a classic sense has not lost relevance, and there are still a lot of interaction. You rather see layers combining rather than the disappearance of the city and the explosion of the urban regions. There are complex relations between them, and it's something to be developed much more systematically, as we were told this morning. It's one of the big research for the urban agenda. What we saw also more and more in many European countries is the most important role of connections and networks and interdependence. To some extent, I would argue in France that indeed regional capitals have been doing extremely well and are still growing economically and demographically, from Saint-Étienne as a difficult case, to Grenoble, to Lyon, to Strasbourg, to Rennes, to Nantes, to Montpellier, to Bordeaux. They are still doing extremely well. But what is striking is the reinforcement of the interactions with Paris. Of course, in a centralized country, you always have interaction with the center, but the TGV lines, and we measure more and more interdependence. In a way, you could argue sometimes that Paris is one metropolis with Paris plus very strong links with Rennes, Nantes, Strasbourg, and all the TGV line. So clearly there are some urban forms that are not well characterized in the European city model, and this rescaling idea is very, very strong. I would also defend the idea that in a number of cases, what we see is also the rescaling of the idea of a city itself, and we see in some bigger urban region the attempt to reorganize the governance of the core of a city at a different scale. Grand Paris is exactly this attempt, and I understand there are some ideas about that in Milan as well. We also saw in a number of those large cities some attempt to strengthen the modes of urban governance. However, like in Italy with the implementation of città metropolitana, in a number of cases this is a very slow, long-term process, and this has not developed as much as I would have expected. Urban democracy, I will go quickly. The third criticism of the book was to say, well, old Max Weber is nothing comparing to Marx. So at the end of the day, despite what happened in those European cities, at the end of the day, capitalism will prevail, and you have this extremely wonderful book by Neil Brenner, my colleague from Harvard, and Neil did a book which was a parallel to my book in a way. He was trying to explain the rise of urban governance in Europe, but by using a post-post neo-Marxist framework, and explaining that the rise of urban governance was explained by the willingness of state to deconcentrate various social policy and to organize competition between cities. And I think the two arguments are very complementary. Even in my view, a lot of those transformations are much more political and not explained only by capitalist accumulation. But there's a Marxist argument that makes sense. The fourth criticism has been to argue that what happened in Europe was in fact explained by the rise of a new community framework. And you have a very large literature explaining that the key point to understand the transformation of cities, particularly in critical urban studies, is the rise of neoliberalism. And again, Brenner and a lot of people, very interesting people, have set up the argument about the neoliberalization of cities. I'll take a minute to develop this argument because it's also a very strong argument to explain transformation of urban policy and transformation of urban governance in other parts of the world. And to be very frank with you, I am a bit fed up with this literature because this neoliberalized, not Brenner and all, they are very precise, but the rest of the literature is always like the deus ex machina explaining some big transformation in an extremely vague way. So can I just remind you, I'm sure you're familiar with the argument, I've just finished a paper and another one with my colleague Mike Stopper, where we try to argue that, if you want to explain that any privatization process is neoliberalization, you make a big mistake. And a lot of this neoliberal literature just does not understand the difference between neoliberalism and liberalism. I mean, cities by nature very often are very strong about liberalism, and you know that liberalism is about the search for private interest and collective good. I mean, I would argue that what is the core of neoliberalism is precisely to show that there is no such thing as market failure. For neoliberals, the idea that when you have problems with markets, you need more markets. And that's a huge difference with liberalism. For liberals, there are market failures. So you have to think about urban policy to go beyond market failures. For neoliberals, there's no such thing as market failure. Just more markets will do. The second argument I would make is that for neoliberals, the state is very important when the liberals are worried about the state. Because neoliberals, they want to use the state to destroy existing social relations. They want to use coercion to discipline the politics and the behavior of individuals. So in many ways, neoliberalism is illiberal and is not liberal. And that's a point that could be debated, but I think it's a very, very different way. I'm not going in the details of all these things, but I want to argue that neoliberalism should be, there are different versions, but should be defined very precisely, because it's a nasty thing. So when you see the neoliberalization of cities, you should be able to locate it very precisely and to explain the mechanism and to give some empirical evidence and not just say everything is becoming neoliberal, which I think doesn't make any sense as far as European cities are concerned. So what we see in European cities, in some cases, very limited, we see some elements of neoliberalization. In the UK, for instance, as you know, the UK is going through a new period of hard Thatcherism. Beyond austerity, you see very strong attempt to put constraints on individuals to force them to maximize their interest in relation to the market, including for local authority. For a number of services, if local authorities accept to privatize or to go for PPP, public-private partnership, then they will get more support from the center. So there's a clear incentivization to oblige them to lock their resources into public-private partnership. So both at the level of urban government and individuals, you have a very strong pressure being exercised by the British states towards neoliberalism. I agree with that. But in lots of other cases, it doesn't make any sense. It's just not what we see. We see austerity, we see some cuts, we see a lot of pressure on the welfare state, and that's bad enough already. You don't need to explain that in terms of neoliberalization, I would argue. But that's a discussion. All right. My point really is to say, okay, so basically my argument was, there was some criticism on the book, but basically I think it worked quite well until the late 2000, and the model was still very robust in a big number of places, although there were exceptions, Italy being one of them. My point is, what happens with a crisis? And what is going on? And what are the main reasons, the main argument, the main conceptual argument to explain what is going on in cities today? I should say it's the beginning of my thinking, so these are just ideas to share. It's not the result of a big research project, okay? So it's just a work in progress. And the argument is very simple. It does still make sense, particularly after these 8 years of crisis, not over, of course, to still think about European cities as I define them, or do we see in the crisis an acceleration of trend leading towards the first scenario I mentioned, the carnage of medium-sized cities, and a reorganization of the urban map in Europe, more through the lines of what we see in the US. And of course, we have some clear indicators in this direction. We see that we have more globalization processes. Large firms are becoming bigger, bigger, and bigger. We see more financialization of capitalism, which for me is one of the central transformations of cities today. We see more mega cities. So I want to examine those trends and those arguments in order to revisit the original model. And as I said, my argument is that I would argue today the transformation of European cities is less explained by their own strategy in a relatively favorable environment, with more public policy, good economic growth, and favorable EU, but rather what is going on in both cities is more explained by the transformation of the EU, the transformation of the nation states, and I always keep the Charles Tilly lesson in mind. To understand cities and state, you always have to think about the relations between the two, and the strategies of large firms, and the transformation of society and mobility. In other words, they are less in charge of their own fate, and I think they have far less room of maneuver. So I would argue that we still see this European city model, but under much more disfavorable conditions and a lot of pressure, which may threaten the model altogether. Let me review some of those arguments, and I will look at scale, EU, states, economic crisis, and technological change. All this is a little bit superficial. I accept that. It's just, that was the idea. I was told by Marco, give us some ideas. It doesn't matter. It's just for discussing with us. I say, all right, but I'm not so sure. First thing, the question of scale. The whole argument about European cities is that until the late 2000s, we had very strong economic and demographic growth, again, less so in Italy, despite being medium-sized. Okay? But when we look at the world scale, my colleagues, geographers, they tell me, you know, your European cities are just completely marginal and dwarf, and they are irrelevant, because what we see is, of course, not just the number of cities and megapolis beyond 15 million inhabitants, but some of them, you know, geographers have a lot of imagination, telling us, you know, the right size, I hate that, right size. You know, a serious megapolis is about 100 million nowadays, you know? Think about the Pearl River Delta, Osaka, Tokyo, beyond 50 million. Around Delhi and Gurgaon, you have a 100 million inhabitants, urban in the making. So there's something to be said, and geographers like Alan Scott from UCLA has eloquently made the point about the global city region argument, and showing how, and my friend and colleague Michael Stopper as well, how in those very big cities you have a concentration of innovation and production of wealth, and you see how in a number of countries a disconnection between wealth creation in the large cities and wealth creation in the other cities. So the argument, which I always resisted, but there is at this moment a much more urban economy, and that in global city regions you see an acceleration of wealth creation by contrast to other type of cities. You know, we have to examine that in the case of the EU, but it's an argument we cannot just say it doesn't make any sense, because of course at the world scale you're familiar with all these maps. European cities are not very strong, you know, not done for a long time, and when you look at the figures for today, basically no European city appear within the top 15 biggest cities of the world, megapolis. Okay, so until now there was enough resources between the state, the EU and the cities to be able to compensate and to be quite strong despite the middle size. Is it still the case today? It's something to be examined more precisely. Just for the fun of it, the French government was very worried when they saw this table. Paris is not in the big city of the world anymore. So they commissioned some geographer to think about the future of Europe so that we will have a big city somewhere. So my friend designed this very nice view of the future of Europe, saying, well, the future of Europe is megacity. Paris, London, Brussels, you need a harbor, put Rotterdam on it, and that will be the new megacity for the future of Europe. And it's quite nice because Paris is more or less in the middle, isn't it? So, you know, that's a nice thing. Of course, this makes absolutely no sense. Okay, it's complete rubbish in terms of looking at the connections. But you can see that the French state is worried. I said there was no European cities on the top 15, and of course I'm wrong. You have three major success stories. One is Moscow, and I will not emphasize Moscow today, but the most important urban development in Europe is Istanbul. And you have the rise of Istanbul from 7 to 15, now 20 million inhabitants, possibly 25. The massive investment of Istanbul make it a major, major player within the urban map. The other major success story in Europe is London, and I will come back to London in a minute. So in a way, if I want to put my American hat, I would say a bit like New York, Los Angeles, what we might be seeing in Europe at the moment is a super concentration of resources and economic and demographic growth in the two extreme parts, Istanbul and London. And if that is the case, that is obviously a threat or something to be taken into account to understand the transformation of European cities. Istanbul, you're familiar. What is of course spectacular has been not just the economic growth, which has been absolutely amazing, with a state development strategy, a developmental state, in a classic sense, like Brazil in the old days or Korea, but also the massive public investment. And you know that in Istanbul they are developing this huge financial district, and already Istanbul is one of the leading financial centers of the world because they get the money from the Emirates, the money from the Russian oligarch, the money for all North Africa, and the money from Israel. And already Istanbul is developing a very, very strong financial center, irrigating Africa and all the Middle East, and even Russia to some extent. And clearly, their view in 20 years is to be the exact rival to London. So the argument, according to which you might see in Europe, a sort of two mega cities at each extreme of a continent, I'm afraid to say, starts to make sense. And we see some elements of that going on. And of course, as you probably know, in terms of massive investment in mosques, in bridges, in tramway, in transport, Turkey in certain housing, it's a massive, massive transformation at a scale which makes super innovative, wonderful project in Barcelona, in Lyon, or in Milan, not exactly at the same scale. So sometimes scale matters, and we have to think about that as a new urban development in Istanbul. The second major transformation of the last 10, 15 years is London. I mean, remember London, and London was a boring, grey, English metropolis with dreadful trains, dreadful metro, complete underinvestment. You know, that was not a very funky city, London, until, you know, quite a while ago. What has happened in London over the last 15 years is absolutely spectacular. Number one, London has had the financial city success story, of course, which has been the main engine for economic development. But second, London has attracted a huge amount of immigrants, 1.5 in 15 years for about 11 million inhabitants. About 3 million are born outside the UK. London has become one of the most multicultural cities in the world. You have 200 nationalities with more than 20,000 people. I mean, London is the 5th French city in the world now. I mean, London has accumulated a lot of very qualified immigrants, and in many ways, regrettably, we have to argue that London has also become the center of the European labor market. What we know about London is that in some countries there is very high young people unemployment, not in Italy, I know, but in my country, in France, it's very well known, all Southern Europe, Germany, and all these young people, a huge amount of them, qualified or not qualified, they go to London. They may not stay there, but they get an experience. They stay 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, and a lot of them stay there, and lots of them come back. London has become the center of a labor market. If there is such a thing as a little bit of a labor market in Europe, it is in London. It is in London. And of course, the universities of London has been fantastically successful to attract good people able to pay from all over the world, including Europe. London has really transformed and has completely managed to take lots of people from all over the world, including Europe, and being the center of Europe. When I say that in Paris, I am not popular. But you see that even with the Eurostar. I mean, the Eurostar was supposed to be the link between Paris and London, but the results are very clear. The figures is that 65% of Eurostar passengers are French. The French go to London, the Brits don't go to Paris very much. And we've just finished a research on French in London and English in Paris. The results are just, you know, you have about 15,000 Brits in Paris region, and you have about 300, 400,000 French in London, number one. Second, when you interview them, why did you go to London? We ask the French. They answer, language, jobs, jobs, jobs. The Brits coming to Paris, why did you come to Paris? I met a French woman or man and I needed to marry her or him. Okay? So Paris is for love and London is for labor market. When I explain that to the Paris City Council, they don't like me. So it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but hardly. So the success of London and beyond the finance in terms of startups, the biotechnology, money in London has really been the engine and has completely transformed the city. And of course, in terms of investment, you know that they have invested massively in public transport. Well, they were so late that they needed to do it anyway, but the physical transformation has also been spectacular. London also attracts money from all over the world. The problem, of course, for urban development is to finance. And finance is a big transformation of capitalism. I am amazed when I see my colleagues looking at cities and not trying to understand the importance of finance. We are in a time of financial capitalism. London attracts 30 billion money every year coming to invest in London. This has become a huge, London is a sort of storage city, okay? So when you have rich people all over the world, in Brazil, the reals is going down, rich Brazilians invest in London. In Hong Kong, the Chinese are going to be, you have the umbrella revolution, Hong Kong people invest in London. Something takes place somewhere and they invest in London. London has become, in French we say la ville coffre-fort, the secure place, the secure safe to invest your money and to build. 200 towers in construction in London at the moment. Most of them will remain empty, by the way. So it's a complete transformation of the way we understand. And my favorite is Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, the guy who say like that. And about a month ago, he went in Highgate. And some engineer will remember that Highgate is the place where Karl Marx is buried. But next to the hill, you have very, very beautiful houses. One of them was sold for £15 million. And Johnson had this wonderful talk saying, we used to say workers from all countries unite. Well, billionaires from all countries unite in London, okay? So clearly, for who do we build cities? London has one answer, which is for the rich. And we are doing that with amazing success. And that has a lot of strong consequences for the rest of the European cities. And I will discuss that in a second. And of course, architects love London because they can build all these funny buildings everywhere. And the Shard. And just to emphasize the importance, what is going on also in this financialization, and I'll come back to it in a moment, is the idea that those buildings are systematically sold and resold and resold. They become financial assets like anything else. You remember the Gherkin, the building by Norman Foster? When they tried to sell it 2 years ago, there were 200 candidates to buy this thing, which the cost was £650 million. Okay? And that was sovereign funds from all over the world to build those things. So London has become a monopoly place where part of the city is more and more organized around financial logic. And of course, this has consequences for the rest of European cities. I will come back in a minute. And of course, they now also invest in infrastructure like Crossrail. But can I emphasize the fact that one of the issues is precisely the scale of this big project and explain also the strategy of large firms. For the large firms, investing lots of resources and money, in Milan, in Napoli, or in Budapest, they used to do that. But why would they do that when you have this multi-million, billion project going on in all the large cities of the world? Because of the urbanization going on and more people in those large cities, you have huge projects going on. So the scale of those projects is massive. In Paris, the Grand Paris Express, this new big transport system which is being built, the cost is about 35 billion euros, more likely to be 50 at the end of the day. So the scale of this project means this money is not going somewhere else. So how can you compete as a medium-sized city? And you see that those bigger projects attract large firms, new expertise, very strong financial, technical, democratic expertise, new ways of doing things. Innovation is taking place in relation to this large project. I hate saying that, but that's what we see. And the one I like very much also is what this is a public project, okay, with public money mostly. And it's a top civil servant, the French elite, running the project. One day, someone knocked at the door. Tuck, tuck, tuck. We are the Chinese sovereign fund. Can we buy all the new stations you're building, 40 of them? We would like to buy all the stations and all the land around. And so you pay for your transport, because we're going to pay for that. what a shock for a French civil servant that the Chinese sovereign fund is able to just say, well, we can bring 30 billion euros and buy all those stations. I mean, this is what is going on in terms of scale of financial transformation. And I think we have to take that seriously to understand the transformation of cities. And all around the stations, you have all this funky project going on. Third factor, which is making life more difficult for European cities, is the EU itself. I was very interested by the talk this morning, and I actually think that at the moment there is some opening for what is going on at the EU. But over the last 15 years, the result is very clear. In 2000, Mr. Prodi, I think, was the head of the Commission, the EU has decided that the priority was the single market, and the single market. And the regional strategy, the regional policy, structural funds were marginalized. Local authorities, Committee of Regions became completely secondary actor at the level of the EU. So European territories that were part of the Delors project have completely lost the political battle. They became marginalized politically, and the regional policy has become marginalized financially. Okay, so the Barroso Commission was, just the end of what we understood as serious regional or urban policy. Of course, the Commission doesn't say that. We've done some precise research on that. And they've been inventing something which is called mainstreaming. Do you know these lovely policy instruments, mainstreaming? It means that instead of having a precise policy with an organization's budget, very boring public policy stuff, you decide that this is old-fashioned policy making, that urban will become a priority in every policy. So now everybody in Brussels create reports and they say, we have become urban. Urban is everywhere. The urban is everywhere. They spend their time writing reports about the importance of the urban, and there is no urban policy at the end of the day. It's called mainstreaming, means marginalization, and it's very clear. So the urban policy at the EU has become ridiculously small and without much interest. It might come back, but too little, too late? I wonder. The point is, European cities have lost one of the big support and source of innovation and legitimation or financial support. My fourth argument is that the most important political transformation going on at the EU at the moment is not anymore decentralization or the rise of this territorial mode of governance that we saw in European cities, but by contrast, the profound transformation of European states. We're just finishing a project on that, but I don't want to be too long on that because it will be, but basically we argue that most European states are still European states, of course, but they are really transforming. One argument is that they have really become member states, in the sense that being part of the EU, a lot of, you know very well in Italy, a lot of political decisions are the result of negotiation with other member states, and only in part the result of political pressure and the result of elections. So all national government, there's a disconnection between the state elite and the nation and the people. And we have a very strong, on a number of policy issues that we study, we see this disconnection. It's as if national elites have bounded themselves, have organized external constraints in order to limit the power of the people. And this is a very serious argument, and you have a lot of public policy analysis to support the argument. Another way to frame it is to argue that nation-states try to have the monopoly to exercise authority, and nowadays they become more the administrator. It's my colleague Philippe Genschel with the European idea. Nation-states are becoming the administrator of various network of authority. And in that new configuration, the nation-state is far less interested in supporting the city and to develop territorial policy. When you look at urban policy, regional policy, in French we used to say aménagement du territoire, lots of those policies have been rather in decline. So what you're trying to do today is a very, very important issue to reinvent and to push for some territorial and urban agenda, because things are not going well in a number of countries. My argument here is that in many countries you see, I'm using Bourdieu's old phrase, the left hand and the right hand of the state. On the one hand, we see a lot of way to do public policy through negotiations, charters, contract, the sort of nice side of governance. But on the other hand, in every country I'm familiar with, you see the right hand of the state, the model invented by Mrs. Thatcher, governing at a distance with indicators of performance and with very low priority for territories. And I think that in a number of policies we see strengthening of this right-hand part of the state. You know, in France, the Ministry of Finance is now giving performance indicators for local authorities. And it's a different way to govern than in the classic negotiating thing. So we see still decentralization trends sometimes, but we see also a lot of financial decentralization and judicial mechanism of re-centralization going on. So, you know, you can still develop some more urban mode of governance, but it is more a struggle, and you really need to organize collectively to be able to get more resources. So in a way, my argument is that a lot of national urban policy is what my friend Alan Harding called new capitalism, massive investment in the capital city. What we saw in countries like Britain, France, and others is that the national state has decided that they needed one or two national champions to become world city, competing with the rest of the world, to attract the qualified people, to attract capital, to attract large firms to build big projects. And in the case of Britain, it was a joke. There was a lack of investment in London. The Olympic Games was the way to justify politically massive investment in London and to leave the North to decline gently. About the state, we should also emphasize, that should be, okay, that's a bit later on. Fifth argument is, of course, the economic crisis, and we still don't know exactly what is going on and what will be the outcome, and if growth will come back some days. But you know, for us, especially for political economists, we always emphasize the importance of politics for European cities. But because of the crisis, because of this EU organizing competition, because of this state restructuring, this issue of economic development is even more at the forefront of what is going on. And we see, because of this changing form of the state, tendency to limit redistribution. When you have 100% of debt in your GDP, what can you do? We see pressure for more competition, and we see pressure for revising some of the classic public policies that were undertook. So all these things, just put this figure here, it's coming from Wolfgang Streeck. We saw in Europe, and the argument of Streeck is that before the crisis, there was already a rise of public debt in many countries, and France and Italy know about that. After the crisis, the first figure is Japan, the other ones are European countries. Italy is number 2 and France number 3. We saw a still deep rise of the debt. And of course, the more in debt you are, the more dependent upon financial markets you are. Financial markets vote every week. Financial markets decide every week whether they're going to give money, to lend money to all European states. And if one day they say, we don't want to lend you money anymore, interest rates go crazy, and you are in very deep trouble financially. So the more in debt you are, the more you are dependent upon the criteria set by financial markets on what is good governance for your own country. So the logic of that is that the capacity of nation state to invest in a number of issues is very limited. Streeck calls about fiscal sclerosis. And you could see even countries like Sweden, where the Swedes have very strongly decreased their investment in education, in research, and they will pay the price in due course. But this is not so good. Financial, on the economic front, accentuation of the financialization of the economy. And what is really strengthening, I mentioned the example of London, is that even for secondary city, you see that the dependence upon financial markets is stronger and stronger to get the capital, to build new places, and to get some demand for a project. I understand that both in Nantes or in Milan, there are some ambitious plans to develop new urban developments, but it's not always easy to have access to capital, and there's not so much demand for those places. Because if those financial funds play a more important role, they also choose where to invest. They have their own way to assess risk. And what we know about the way they work is that the way they assess the risk is that they concentrate their investment in a limited number of cities, and medium-sized European cities are not one of them. So the growing importance of financial markets in the production of the urban form, sustaining big projects and big developments, is not good news for normal European cities. So if you're in Paris, or you're in London, possibly in Milan, or in Istanbul, very easy to get lots of money, lots of projects, lots of demands on everything. Elsewhere, it's becoming more and more difficult. And that's, for me, one of the big differences. And that also applies for utility networks, for telecom, for new projects to recycle waste, for all these projects. And it's a different way from the classic networks that we used to see. And of course, examples of the financial markets and the crisis and ghost town in Ireland are very well known. Another thing we've seen in a number of cities is the transformation of private developers. In my group in the urban school at Sciences Po, we do a lot of research on private developers and the way they change their strategy over time. And we've done some research in Britain, Spain, and France. And what is going on with the crisis, some of them collapse, not many, but what is going on is that lots of them are consolidating and are becoming more and more international private developers. It's the first time that French developers are going to London. They never went before. You see Spanish private developers also reorganizing and developing international strategies. So private developers, always a mix between local and national and international. We see a very strong consolidation of very big firms in private development, supported by all this capital I have mentioned before. And that is changing the rule of the game for European cities, I would argue. And what is striking is that when you look at who has the expertise, who has the knowledge, who has the innovation to develop ambitious urban projects, a new business district, a new eco-friendly neighborhood, all these things. What is striking, but we don't have pure evidence, is that a lot of the expertise, a lot of the capacity to develop this project, a lot of innovations is not in the public sector anymore. It's in the private sector. In France, it's absolutely striking, the change over 20, 25 years. And that's, again, a big difference. I should stop quickly. So, fifth argument is to argue that the European city model was also relying upon relatively homogeneous population. You know that in Europe, we are not very much transnationally mobile. The rate of transnational mobility, the number of people going to another country to live every year is not very high. Every year the Commission does a report about mobility in Europe, every 2 years. And they start by saying, all right, we've done the single market. We are organizing Schengen until now. We are organizing everything, Erasmus. And those bloody Europeans, they don't move. Just they increase a little bit every year, but we have very low rate of transnational mobility. So I always say that Bruce Springsteen used to sing, Americans are born to run, well, Europeans are born to stay. And in this model, what we see is, number one, aging population, of course. Number two, more and more migration, not a huge amount, but slowly all European cities have to deal with some forms of multiculturalism, more diverse ethnic and cultural groups. And we are not very good to know how to deal with that, as we know in our countries. And even in Sweden, we have riots now based upon ethnic communities. So everybody's trying to create, and we see all sorts of reorganizations, some groups saying maybe we should get gated communities, maybe we'll have more inequalities. So it's a very different story from a classic European city. So that's my view of European societies, thanks to Jackson Pollock, when people become more mobile. And we see in a number of cities some forms of embourgeoisement going on in the prestigious city centers, a little bit of gentrification, a completely overused word. We see some neighborhood in crisis, not really ghettos, but we see some discrimination. Not massive increase of ethnic and social inequalities, but some. And can I just emphasize, we are still very, very, very different from the US. And my colleagues like Edmond Pressé in Paris, Maloutas in Athens, Chris Hamnet in London, like Edmond Pressé has shown extremely clearly that in the case of the Paris region, over the last 30 years, you have a very strong decrease of spatial inequality, a very strong decrease of social segregation, okay? And the numbers are very clear, with two exceptions, the extreme. We have a stronger increase of poverty in the worst neighborhoods in Saint-Denis, ethnic and social, and we see some rich people more and more in enclaves in the west of Paris. So for the last 20, 30 years, the story was some extreme, but the story is decreased social segregation and ethnic segregation, okay? But nowadays, the problem is that the two extremes are becoming bigger and bigger. So we are not entirely sure that what was one of the characteristics of European cities will last over time. Again, a question mark and some worry. Last thing is about mobility. I don't want to be too much, but what we know about Europe is that we don't have a lot of transnational mobility. I've said that. But we have a rise of mobility. We have more and more people moving within their own country or going to another country for a short term. We just finished a book, just an advertisement, with my colleague Alberto Andreotti and Javier Moreno-Fuentes on upper middle class in Europe and the way they are mobile. And what is very striking is that we see that more and more people are going, you know, for leisure, for a weekend. You spend some weekend in Paris or Brussels or Geneva or Prague, and we have more and more people slowly becoming a little bit more mobile in Europe. Okay? But Europeans, they tend to go away, not for a long time, under very strict conditions, and they come back where they were before. So we have a particular European way, European city way to be mobile, but over time, this is exactly the case of what we call slow, incremental, long-term processes. There's nothing spectacular on the short term, but over the long term, you know, all this mobility is also a filtering process, where some cities accumulate some of the good people, the more qualified people, and slowly some cities accumulate more aging people, less degree, less qualification. So the more mobility you have, even if it's slow and incremental growth, the more filtering process, reorganizing cities is taking place. And I think within 10 or 20 years, we will see the long-term consequence of that. And I should also emphasize the demographic element that Joanne mentioned this morning. Because as we know, one of the effects of the crisis has been the fact that in all Southern Europe, including France, nearly 1 million people left Portugal. We know that lots of young Italians have gone away, massive number in Spain, strong number in France as well. In the classic model, they should go and they should come back where they were before. I am not entirely sure they will come back. I'm not entirely sure there will be growth, there will be jobs. And you know, I really want to emphasize, at least in France, this is a French comment, we see a very strong gap between generations. We start measuring in terms of value something we have not seen since 1968. I'm not saying 1968 is back. I'm just suggesting that there are stronger gap in terms of values, representation of the world, imagination of cities between the young generation and the older generation. The big difference with 68 is that in those days, 68 people were big numbers. They were a huge number. Nowadays, big numbers are old people, young people, small numbers. So they may not find their way. And if you don't find your way, those young people, especially the most qualified, they can exit. And we don't know whether we will exit for good or just for some time. But if we go for the worst scenario, I'm just the dark man today, if those people, or some of them, don't come back, that will accelerate the aging of European cities, of course. And as we don't want to have migrants in our cities, you know, the model of European cities might be eventually gentle decline over time. And I think this demographic issue and the investment on young people is an absolute priority that we don't do, at least not in my country. The last thing, and I will stop there, is the question of technology. And as you know very well, all this revolution on digital, cyborg, big data, I mean, all our cities have become a huge concentration of technologies. And in urban studies, except geographers, we are very bad to take that into account in a systematic way. And clearly, we see a complete transformation of the management of a number of services linked to those technologies. And we don't know how to do that. We know this three-dimension plan to build in a very collaborative way. We see implementation of all sorts of things. You probably have missed an earthquake in France. In the spring, something absolutely dramatic took place. There was a competition to build the new university in Caen, in Normandy. Okay? So the big construction firm, we have, like in Italy, some very strong construction firm, like Bouygues, they all went and had a big project going to build the new university. And they lost. The winner is Orange. Orange, French leading telecom firms, mobile firm. Now they are becoming builders. And they have developed a project where they say, you know, to build a big university, what you have to control is information. You have to build a three-dimension plan. You have to organize collaborative projects with all sorts of firms. You can assemble a lot of your building in different parts of the world, and then through the information technology, you control the process. With our technology, we are cheaper, we are less corrupt, We can collaborate with all sorts of groups during the process, and we can bring completely sophisticated little branches of technicism in the project. They want the project. I can tell you that. The big French construction firms, Bouygues is one of the top 3 in the world, they have spent a very bad summer. They are completely freaking out. They're saying, this is Uber coming in the construction of cities. If we lose to France, to telecoms, I mean, we are done. Okay? So it's complete panic in the top French constructing industry. And I think we have to be serious about that, because in a number of domains, we see some very strong implications, both in terms of urban democracy and political participations. And we know, sensors, data networks, robots, all these things makes a big difference. Just a few images. And of course, a lot of representation about the city. So I pay tribute to Guido Martinotti, about all this mobility around the city. And this is an image about Facebook people and all sort of networks. You can represent all these people. Clearly, one of the challenges with those technologies and all these apps is that we always think about cities as this combination of a territory and connections and flux. With those technologies, the flux dimension, the mobility dimension is becoming more important than before. And that's a very big threat for the classic model of a European city. Even if, as I mentioned before, individuals remain very attached to the territory and they don't like to be mobile. That's those machines that will deliver the pizza very soon, I'm told. And of course, in that story, the big firms are playing a major role, and you know that IBM and the Smart City project is like, Big Brother is watching you. So I think those things are important, and in those data, clearly the transformation of the governance of cities is about associating various types of data from the ecology, from the metabolism, from the food, to the technology, to the labor market, and to the transformation of flux over the cities. How we govern those flux with this data, we are not entirely sure. But as social scientists, we should worry a little bit about those things, even if there are also a lot of interesting potential development in terms of political participation and neighborhood participations in various projects. This is virtual Singapore. Singapore, which is a dictatorship, in effect, has a fantastic project to really become the first high-tech city in the world, and it's an interesting experiment to follow in all sorts. Conclusion, last point. Yes, we still have European cities, and the model that I try to elaborate of European city is still in place, and we see still some long-term consequence of the development of this urban development and governance strategies. However, this model is under very unfavorable circumstances because of cuts, because of technological change, because of the economic crisis, because of state restructuring, because the EU has become more liberal. The environment is much more competitive and difficult. And you could expect that some cities will manage to go well, but maybe not all of them. Those transformations are very strong. So yes, I still believe that both cities are political beasts, that they still have a lot of resources, but this is a time for rough seas. And it's probably why we need an urban agenda, and the need to govern, to develop collective action, is more important than ever. If not, the carnage scenario is on the cards. Thank you.